September 5th, 1944, dawn over the Dutch borderlands. The fields near Valkenswaard still glisten with dew when Corporal Arthur McKenzie of the First Battalion, Grenadier Guards, slides the bipod legs of his Bren gun into the soft mud at the base of a hedgerow. To his right, the engine noise of Sherman tanks from the Guards Armoured Division hums through the mist. Ahead, beyond the tree line, comes the slow, steady rattle of a German MG42, the unmistakable scream of a weapon that could turn air into steel. For 5 years of war, British infantrymen had learned to recognize that sound instantly. A mechanical howl, 1,200 rounds a minute, impossible to mistake for anything else. McKenzie listens for it now, then gently thumbs back the cocking handle of his Bren. Its smooth metallic click feels reassuring, almost intimate a mechanical heartbeat he has lived beside since Dunkirk. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Bren is warm to his hand despite the morning chill. He knows its weight precisely, 23 pounds with a full 30-round magazine. He has cleaned every piece of it by candlelight in bombed-out churches and dripping foxholes. In his platoon, the Bren gunner is the anchor, the one the others move with and rally behind. When the German gun across the field opens up again, McKenzie breathes out, sights along the curved magazine, and presses the trigger. The Bren's rhythm is deliberate, almost calm. 500 rounds per minute, not the MG42's frenzy, but a steady, measured pulse. Each burst walks across the hedgerow like a metronome of British discipline. In that moment, the difference between the two empires' machines and the philosophies behind them becomes audible. To the Germans, war is velocity, the MG42's, blistering rate of fire designed to dominate through shock and volume, requiring a 3-man crew, heavy ammunition belts, and constant barrel changes. To the British, war is endurance, a weapon light enough for one man to carry, accurate enough to pick off a target with a short burst, and reliable enough to keep firing after a week in the mud of Normandy. That morning at Valkenswaard, Mackenzie's bursts pinned down a German machine gun team long enough for the Shermans to advance. The Bren's staccato rhythm, precise, economical, unmistakably British, becomes the soundtrack of progress across Northern Europe. To understand why the Bren became the heart of British infantry doctrine, we must return to an earlier Europe, one still haunted by the failures of the Great War. In the aftermath of 1918, Britain possessed the largest empire on earth, but a deeply scarred military memory. The First World War had taught a brutal arithmetic. Machine guns, not men, decided battles. The Vickers heavy machine gun, a water-cooled behemoth weighing nearly 40 pounds without its tripod, had served faithfully across the Western Front. Entire sections of infantry had existed merely to feed and carry it. But as the interwar years unfolded, military thinkers sought something different, a weapon that could bring the firepower of the machine gun into the mobility of the rifle section. The British Army, reduced by austerity and colonial policing, needed an automatic weapon that a single soldier could carry across the Empire's vast and varied battlefields, from the deserts of Aden to the jungles of Burma. At the same time, the very concept of infantry firepower was being reimagined across Europe. The Germans, constrained by the Treaty of Versailles, were secretly developing ideas that would culminate in the general-purpose machine gun, a single weapon, the MG34, and later MG42, that could serve as both light and heavy machine gun through quick barrel changes and bipod or tripod mounts. The British approach was more conservative, but equally ambitious in its own way, to give every infantry section a single automatic weapon of precision and reliability, wielded by a designated gunner, the Bren. The name itself, Bren, came from two cities separated by hundreds of miles. Brno in Czechoslovakia, where the original ZB-26 light machine gun had been designed, and Enfield in Britain, home to the Royal Small Arms Factory. The British government had been impressed by the Czech weapon's simplicity and accuracy during tests in the early 1930s. In 1935, the design was officially adopted, modified to fire Britain's standard 303 rimmed cartridge, a decision that would have vast implications for the weapon's mechanics. The 303 cartridge, originally developed in the Victorian era for the Lee Metford and later the Lee Enfield rifles, was not ideal for automatic feed. Its pronounced rim meant cartridges had to be carefully stacked in magazines to avoid jamming, one of the reasons many other nations had shifted to rimless rounds. Yet British ordnance officers, reluctant to overhaul ammunition production for the entire army and empire, insisted the new gun must use it. The Czechs delivered. The redesigned weapon, officially designated the Bren gun, Mark I, light machine gun, 303-inch, was accepted into service in 1938. It was heavier than the original Czech ZB, over 22 pounds unloaded but exquisitely balanced. It could be fired from the shoulder, the hip, or from its integral folding bipod. The curved, top-mounted magazine held 30 rounds, though trained gunners usually loaded only 28 to reduce spring pressure and ensure reliable feeding. From its very first issue, the Bren was regarded as a craftsman's weapon built with the precision of a Karges, fine sporting rifle. Each was assembled from machined steel components with almost obsessive tolerances. The Mark I model included a finely adjustable rear sight and a folding carrying handle on the barrel. Soldiers would later joke that it was too well made for war, yet its quality would become legendary in the years ahead. When the Second World War erupted in September 1939, Britain had just begun issuing the Bren across its forces. By the time of the retreat to Dunkirk in 1940, over 30,000 had been produced, barely enough to equip frontline units. Yet even in those desperate days, the Bren earned a reputation for steadfastness. Sergeant Fred Mudd, of the 2nd Battalion, Royal Norfolk Regiment, recorded in his diary during the withdrawal from the Dial line, "We carried the Bren through ditches, over fences, even across canals. It fell in the water once and I thought it finished. But we drained it, gave it a pull, and it fired like a charm. You could trust it when nothing else worked." That trust was not misplaced. In field tests conducted by the Small Arms School Corps in 1941, a single Bren fired over 12,000 rounds without a major stoppage, even after exposure to sand and rain. The gun's quick-change barrel allowed sustained fire, though at a far slower pace than the German MGs. It could maintain accuracy and reliability long after their barrels had overheated. The difference between the two systems was philosophical as much as technical. German doctrine treated the machine gun as the centerpiece of the squad, 6 to 8 men, maneuvering to protect and feed the weapon. British doctrine made the Bren part of the section, not its master. A standard British infantry section of 10 men included 1 Bren gunner, 1 assistant gunner, who carried spare magazines and the second barrel, and 8 riflemen. Every man trained to handle the Bren, but its operation was fundamentally the Bren, responsibility of a single pair. That division of labour reflected an unspoken truth. The British Army fought with fewer men, fewer resources, and less time for retraining than its continental enemies. Efficiency, not spectacle, defined its weapons. The Bren was designed for deliberate, accurate bursts, often 3 to 5 rounds at a time, aimed rather than sprayed. In British marksmanship training manuals, it was emphasised repeatedly that the Bren is a rifle that happens to fire automatically. Across the Channel, the German MG42 told a different story. Introduced in 1942 as a simplification of the MG34, it fired at an astonishing cyclic rate around 1,200 rounds per minute. Its belt-fed system required at least 3 crewmen, a gunner, a loader, feeding belts and changing barrels, and an ammunition carrier. A 4-man team was preferred to maintain continuous fire. Its psychological impact was immense. Allied troops nicknamed it Hitler's buzzsaw, yet that devastating speed came at a cost. The MG42's barrels overheated after as few as 200 rounds, demanding rapid changes. Ammunition belts jammed in mud or froze in cold conditions. The weapon's dispersion at range was high, and its weight, over 25 pounds plus tripod or spare barrels, made it far less mobile than its reputation suggested. The Bren's slower rate of fire, roughly 500 rounds per minute, might appear modest by comparison, but it produced a stability and controllability that frontline troops valued deeply. On the range, Experienced Bren gunners could place every bullet of a short burst within a single foot-wide grouping at 200 yards. In combat, that precision meant economy. Every bullet mattered. As the war expanded, the Bren followed British troops into every theatre. In the sands of El Alamein, Bren guns mounted on tripods provided suppressive fire against German positions. In the jungles of Burma, they were carried through monsoon rains wrapped in oiled cloth, emerging days later ready to fire. In the frozen hedgerows of Normandy, the Bren's distinctive top magazine and bipod silhouette became a symbol of the British advance. In letters home, soldiers often spoke of their Bren guns as if they were comrades. Lieutenant Richard Carver of the 8th Army wrote from Tunisia in 1943, "The Bren has become our friend. It does not jam, it does not argue, and it has a most comforting bark when you are in a tight corner." Back in the Netherlands, as Corporal McKenzie's section pushes through the fields toward Eindhoven, that same reliability carries the day. When his barrel glows red, he signals his assistant to swap it. The spare clicks into place in seconds. His gun stays level on the bipod, the recoil gentle, predictable. Each time he squeezes the trigger, he feels the clean break of its two-stage pull, the distinct clack of the bolt, the solid rhythm that has become second nature. The German gun, by contrast, alternates between fury and silence, bursts of impossible speed, followed by long pauses for barrel changes or belt feeding. The sound of its mechanism is harsh, almost animal. The Bren's is crisp, human, composed. What McKenzie cannot see, what few infantrymen ever could, is that behind this duel of rhythm lies a deeper story, a clash not just of engineering, but of worldviews. Germany's MG42 represents an industrial philosophy of extremes, a weapon built for total war, optimized for output at the cost of finesse. It was stamped from sheet steel, its parts interchangeable, its purpose singular: to project fear. Britain's Bren represents a different path, a machine built to last, not to overwhelm. It was machined, fitted, adjusted, meant to be trusted rather than feared. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The irony is profound. The MG42 would go on to inspire nearly every post-war machine gun from the American M60 to the modern MG3 used by NATO. The Bren, by contrast, would fade quietly into the background, replaced by the FN MAG and later the L7 series. Yet, for the men who carried it, the Bren was more than a weapon. It was a lifeline, a piece of engineering that reflected the British soldier's own temperament. Patient, stubborn, unshowy, and enduring. In the months that followed the liberation of the Netherlands, Mackenzie's section fought through rain and snow toward the Rhine. His Bren survived the crossing, the occupation of Germany, and the long return home. When he demobilized in 1946, he kept a photograph of the gun in his wallet. Beneath it, in pencil, he had written a single line: "She never let me down." The deeper truth about the Bren's quiet triumph does not lie in its rate of fire or its outward elegance, but in the astonishing infrastructure that allowed such a weapon to exist and endure through 6 years of total war. The British Empire in 1939 was not an industrial monolith like the United States, nor a militarized powerhouse like Germany. It was a network, a web of factories, depots, and colonial arsenals stretched from Birmingham to Bombay. And at the heart of that network, one rifle-caliber light machine gun became both a logistical puzzle and a symbol of resilience. The Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield Lock had begun full Bren production in 1937, retooling its machinery from the Lee-Enfield rifle lines. Each gun required over 2,000 separate machining operations, involving nearly 600 components. A skilled fitter could assemble only 2 or 3 in a day. The weapon's exquisite tolerances, which ensured its legendary reliability, also made it extraordinarily slow to produce. As the war expanded, Britain's need for Bren guns exploded. By 1940, the War Office estimated a minimum requirement of 50,000 guns to fully equip the army at home and overseas. Yet Enfield's total output that year was barely 12,000. The British solution was as imperial as it was practical: decentralise production across the Commonwealth. In 1941, the Canadian government established a shadow factory at John Inglis and Company in Toronto, a manufacturer of refrigerators and washing machines converted almost overnight into a precision arms producer. Using blueprints and Czech tooling smuggled out of Europe before the German occupation, Inglis began producing Bren guns identical to the British Mark I, later simplified to the Mark II. Within 2 years, their assembly lines were turning out over 60,000 guns annually, many destined for China under the British Lend-Lease programme. Australian factories in Lithgow and New South Wales joined the effort, followed by Indian production in Ishapur. The Empire's industrial network, often derided as outdated and fragmented, proved astonishingly adaptable. By the end of 1945, over 500,000 Bren guns had been produced across Britain and the Commonwealth. Contrast this with Germany's MG42. The Rheinmetall Borsig design team had achieved what the Wehrmacht considered a triumph of efficiency, a weapon that could be mass-produced from stamped and welded components. Its manufacturing time was reduced to less than 75 hours per unit, compared to nearly 300 for the MG34. In total, over 400,000 MG42s were built between 1942 and 1945, along with millions of spare barrels and tens of millions of linked rounds. Yet here lay the paradox. The MG42's brilliance was inseparable from Germany's industrial self-destruction. Each weapon devoured ammunition up to 150 rounds per minute in sustained combat. Supplying a single MG team for 1 day of frontline engagement required over 3,000 rounds, weighing nearly 200 pounds. Logistics convoys struggled to keep pace, particularly on the Eastern Front, where ammunition consumption outstripped production by late 1943. The Bren's economy of fire, by contrast, made it ideal for an army that prized conservation. British doctrine dictated bursts of 3 to 5 rounds, each aimed and observed. A single section could carry 20 to 30 magazines into battle, roughly 600 to 800 rounds, and remain combat effective for hours. In post-action analyses from the North African campaign, British quartermasters noted that Bren sections averaged less than half the ammunition expenditure of comparable German units, while achieving equal or greater suppression at short range. Behind these statistics lay something even more human: the way the weapon shaped its user's mind. In German training manuals, the MG was the soul of the infantry. The rest of the squad existed to serve it to carry belts, spare barrels, tripods, and ammunition boxes. German soldiers were drilled to think of the MG as their collective purpose. The gunner was rarely the senior man. Instead, he was one specialist in a system of mechanical dependency. In British infantry culture, the Bren created a different psychology. It belonged to an individual. Each gun was issued to a named soldier, recorded by serial number in company ledgers. Gunners cleaned them, carried them, and often referred to them possessively. In the 1942 Infantry Training Manual, the Bren section was described as a living organism whose eye and hand are the gunner himself. The assistant gunner was there to reload and observe, not to serve. This intimacy between man and machine produced a unique battlefield discipline. Accounts from Normandy repeatedly describe Bren gunners holding fire until certain of their aim, a restraint alien to German doctrine. Private Leonard Hornby of the South Lancashire Regiment recalled, "You could hear the difference. Their guns came like tearing cloth, one great burst. Ours was like knocking on a door. We never fired blind. You'd squeeze off 3 rounds, then another 3, like tapping out a message." To the untrained ear, the MG42's scream. To those who fought beneath it, the Bren's quieter cadence was more powerful in practice. Its slow, deliberate bursts allowed riflemen to move confidently under its cover. The German teams, meanwhile, found themselves betrayed by their own firepower. The moment an MG42 opened up, every Allied rifle and mortar zeroed in on its position. Its muzzle flash, its noise, and the telltale clouds of dust it kicked up made concealment impossible. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, this disparity reached its cruelest proof. Reports from the First Battalion Royal Hampshire Regiment at Gold Beach describe Bren teams advancing under direct MG42 fire from German strongpoints. Despite being outgunned by rate of fire, the Bren gunners' controlled bursts pinned the defenders long enough for engineers to flank and neutralise the positions. Captain James Broome noted in his after-action report, "Our Brens performed beyond expectation. Their stability under fire and accuracy at range more than compensated for the German volume of fire. It is the difference between a hammer and a scalpel." That scalpel precision was not accidental. The Bren's unique top-mounted magazine and downward-hinged receiver created a nearly straight-line recoil path. Combined with its relatively heavy barrel and bipod mount, it allowed the gun to remain steady during automatic fire. The MG42, lighter in its moving parts and higher in cyclic rate, produced a violent recoil that made controlled bursts difficult. British armourers understood this balance intuitively. The Bren's gas-operated piston system was adjustable through a regulator with 4 settings, allowing the gunner to compensate for fouling or extreme temperatures. In desert conditions, the wide-open setting ensured reliable cycling even when sand entered the mechanism. In Arctic cold, the narrow setting conserved gas pressure. German gunners had no such luxury. Their air-cooled barrels demanded constant vigilance and mechanical ritual. By 1944, this difference had become psychological destiny. German troops, once the masters of maneuver warfare, were increasingly pinned to static defensive positions, their MGs chained to the ground by ammunition and overheating. British infantry, with lighter weapons and smaller logistical tails, could move. The Bren's 23 pounds might seem heavy, but compared to the MG42's full combat load over 60 pounds with tripod and belts, it was liberation. One of the most vivid records of this contrast comes from the Battle of the Reichswald in February 1945. During the Allied advance into the Rhineland, units of the 15th Scottish Division fought through flooded woods and mud nearly 3 feet deep. The Germans, entrenched with MG42s, were formidable. Yet British patrols, often moving by night and unable to haul heavy equipment, relied entirely on their Brens. Sergeant Colin Stokes of the 6th Battalion, King's Own Scottish Borderers, later described one encounter in his memoir. "We came under fire from what sounded like 3 or 4 MG42s. You could hear them cutting the branches off the trees. We went to ground, waited, then I told my gunner, 'Give it 2 bursts, centre-left.' He did short, steady. It was enough to silence one of them. We moved, fired again, and by morning they'd gone. You could not have done that with their gun. Too heavy, too loud, too hot." Such experiences shaped not only morale but tactical doctrine. By 1944, British commanders formally recognised the Bren's versatility. Manuals expanded its authorised roles to include use as a light support weapon from vehicles, in anti-aircraft mounts, and even for indirect plunging fire against enemy trenches. Photographs from the Normandy campaign show Bren guns mounted on universal carriers, on tanks, on jeeps, and even on bicycle frames. Each adaptation spoke to a weapon designed not merely for destruction, but for endurance, a tool rather than an idol. The Germans, too, understood the Bren's value. Captured examples were catalogued as Leichtes MG138A and used extensively by Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS units, particularly on the Eastern Front, where ammunition supply for captured 303 guns was possible from British or Commonwealth dumps. Reports from the 20th Panzer Division in late 1943 note that the English MG was highly accurate and reliable, though criticised for insufficient volume of fire. Volume was, indeed, the MG42's only advantage, but one that increasingly worked against Germany. By 1944, with fuel shortages, collapsing logistics, and Allied air superiority, the very characteristics that once defined the MG42's dominance, its appetite, its conspicuousness, its sound became liabilities. The Bren, modest and durable, thrived under scarcity, and so, by the final year of the war, a quiet irony unfolded across Europe. The weapon of empire outlasted the weapon of blitzkrieg. But the full measure of that irony would not be understood until after the shooting stopped. When the British Army began its demobilisation in 1946, tens of thousands of Bren guns were returned to depots, their barrels worn smooth, their wooden stocks scarred and darkened by sweat. Inspectors at the Royal Ordnance Factory were astonished at their condition. Many guns had fired tens of thousands of rounds with minimal wear. Their mechanisms, when cleaned and gauged, still met factory tolerances. In contrast, captured MG42s examined by Allied ordnance officers often showed severe erosion, cracked receivers, and burned-out barrels after comparatively brief service. The contrast mirrored the nations that built them, one exhausted by its own ferocity, the other preserved by measured persistence. Yet history's ironies rarely end neatly. The Bren, though beloved, was a product of an age that was ending. The post-war world would demand weapons as standardized as its alliances. The FN MAG, developed in Belgium using lessons from both the Bren and the MG42, would combine their virtues, the Bren's stability and the German gun's belt feed system. By the 1950s, the MAG would become the NATO standard, and the Bren would gradually fade from frontline service, though not from memory. Still, in the ruins of 1945, among the men who had carried it, the Bren remained a symbol of something more than firepower. It represented craftsmanship in an age of mass production, individual responsibility in a war of machines. Sergeant Stokes would later write, reflecting on his wartime service, "You could tell a man by the way he treated his Bren. If he cleaned it with care, you knew he'd watch your back. If he rushed it, you moved your bedroll away from his in the trench. That gun was our test of character." When the last Bren guns were stacked in the armories of Europe, a peculiar silence settled over the weapon's legacy. It was not the thunderous silence of obsolescence, but the quiet of a veteran that had done its duty and retired with dignity. In peacetime Britain, the Bren's image was almost domestic. Children saw them in war films beside mugs of enamel tea, balanced on sandbags, as familiar as the flat caps of the men who carried them. But for those who had lived behind its sights, it was something more intimate, a bridge between the craft of the individual soldier and the mechanical world that was coming. The British Army kept the Bren in service through Korea and into the 1,960 rechambered for the NATO 7.62mm round, and redesignated the L4 light machine gun. In Malaya, British and Commonwealth forces fought a jungle war that was as far from Normandy as the moon, yet the same principles held. Fire in short bursts, conserve ammunition, trust the rhythm. Jungle patrols would move in silence for hours, the Bren slung across the shoulders of the section's most reliable man. When the ambush came, and it always came, the guns spoke first, measured and deliberate. It was still the same knocking sound that Leonard Hornby had described 20 years before. American observers in Korea noticed the same phenomenon. They called it British fire discipline, and it impressed them. Where US squads relied on volume and the BAR's hurried bursts, British units advanced under the steady heartbeat cadence of a single gun. It was not the fastest, but it was often the last still firing when the magazines were counted. By the 1,970 the L4 had become a training relic, its shape instantly recognizable to generations of recruits. Even after it was formally replaced by the belt-fed L7 GPMG, the FN MAG, the Bren lingered in territorial units and armories across the Commonwealth. India, Malaysia, and Kenya would keep it well into the 1,980. In some African armies, Bren guns refurbished from wartime stocks remained operational into the 21st century, a 70-year service life that few automatic weapons could match. But the true afterlife of the Bren is not measured in years of service. It endures in the ethic it represented. Where the German MG42 embodied the industrial crescendo rate of fire as ideology, the Bren embodied restraint as philosophy. Its rhythm was the rhythm of a nation that had learned to survive by endurance, not excess. In the cultural imagination, that difference persisted. Post-war German cinema often treated the MG42 with awe or fear, its staccato roar still shorthand for mechanized terror. British films, From the longest day to a bridge too far, gave the Bren a quieter dignity, the gun as companion, not instrument of spectacle. To the veterans, that distinction mattered. In interviews recorded by the Imperial War Museum during the 1980 seconds, dozens of former infantrymen used the same phrases to describe their Brens: steady, reliable. You could trust it. One recalled sleeping with his Bren beside him every night in Normandy, not for comfort, just because it was part of you. Contrast that with German veterans of the same campaign. Their recollections of the MG42 are laced with ambivalence, pride in its power, fear of its exposure. You loved the gun, one Wehrmacht machine gunner told an interviewer, but you hated what it made you do. Once you opened fire, the world turned on you. Here, perhaps, lies the moral anatomy of these two machines. One demanded submission, the other invited stewardship. By the late 20th century, historians began to see the Bren not merely as a weapon, but as a case study in how design reflects doctrine. In the archives of the Royal Armouries at Leeds, one finds memos from 1937 that read less like engineering notes and more like moral instructions. The light machine gun must be operable by one man, of sound judgment, and maintainable in the field with limited means. It was, in effect, a moral machine built on the assumption that a soldier could be trusted with discretion. The MG42 came from a different set of assumptions, that the machine, if efficient enough, could overcome the fallibility of men. It was the logic of the assembly line translated into tactics, and so the Bren's real victory was philosophical. It proved that craftsmanship and judgment could coexist with mechanization. In the ruins of Europe, that lesson quietly guide the designers of the next generation of weapons, the FN MAG, the HK-21, even the American M60. All bore the genetic trace of the Bren's stability and the MG's mechanical aggression, fused into a new synthesis of man and machine. There is a sound engineer's call the Bren beat, the particular pattern of its automatic cycle recorded in wartime films. When analyzed spectrally, it shows a remarkably consistent periodicity, 512 rounds per minute, rarely deviating by more than 1%, even under field conditions. That stability was not an accident of metallurgy. It was the product of balance. Soldiers noticed it instinctively. The Bren's rhythm became a kind of metronome for movement. One veteran of the 1st Parachute Brigade recalled timing his advances by the Bren's bursts. 3 paces per knock. You moved on its beat. Modern psychologists studying combat behavior sometimes refer to this as entrainment, the synchronization of human motion to predictable external stimuli. In the chaos of battle, that regularity could mean survival. A gun that fired too fast disrupted that rhythm. A gun that fired too slowly failed to sustain it. The Bren, at its measured half-kilohertz cadence, sat precisely at the tempo of a human heart under stress. That may be coincidence, or perhaps, as some armourers believed, it was destiny in design. The Bren's story also illuminates something larger about Britain's wartime society, the persistence of craft culture within an industrial war. Each Bren leaving Enfield bore the marks of dozens of craftsmen whose names never appeared in headlines. Fitters, polishers, gauge inspectors, women who assembled feed covers under blackout lamps. The tolerances that made the weapon reliable depended on their hands, not machines. During the height of the Blitz, Enfield workers slept in the factory's tunnels to keep production running. Some brought their children, who played among crates of precision-milled barrels. After the war, many of those same workers went back to making peacetime goods, bicycles, sewing machines, cameras, but the ethos remained. It is no accident that post-war British engineering culture, from Rolls-Royce to BSA motorcycles, carried echoes of the Bren's philosophy: reliability through care, not haste. A weapon of memory. Every nation keeps one weapon as a mirror of its character. For America, it is the Garand powerful, democratic, abundant. For Germany, the MG42 terrible in its perfection. For Britain, it is the Bren unassuming, patient, steady. In the small museums of market towns and regimental halls, you can still find them, their metal dulled by decades, but their balance unchanged. Veterans' grandchildren lift them gingerly and remark on the weight, surprised that something so heavy could be carried by one man. They cannot hear the old rhythm, but those who once did still remember. In 1995, at a reunion of the 50th Northumbrian Division, a 90-year-old gunner named Thomas Hale was asked what he remembered most about the Bren. He smiled and tapped his fingers on the table, a slow, even rhythm. "It never panicked," he said, "and if your gun doesn't panic, neither do you." That, in the end, may be the Bren's final lesson that calm can be a weapon as powerful as fire. If the MG42 was the sound of an empire collapsing under its own velocity, the Bren was the sound of one holding together by grace of rhythm. Each represented its nation's soul in metal, one frantic, the other deliberate, one worshipping speed, the other trusting steadiness. Today, historians often debate which was better. The truth is simpler and more profound. Each was perfect for the world that built it. But only one of those worlds survived, and so the Bren's measured beat continues not in barrages or museums alone, but in the unspoken ideal it carried. That mastery is quieter than noise, and that a single, calm man with a well-made tool can still shape the fate of armies. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.